What if the loudest claim in Washington was shattered in less than 24 hours by a single strike that exposed a much bigger truth? What happened at Prince Sultan Air Base is not just another battlefield update. It may be the moment this entire war narrative started to crack, because while leaders were telling the world the fight was already over, missiles were still getting through. And the target was not random. It was one of the most important American military hubs in the region, the kind of place that is supposed to be protected by layers of air defense, radar coverage, and constant readiness. Yet Iran hit it, then hit it again, then hit it again. And each strike told a more dangerous story than the last. Stay with me, because the deeper you go into this, the more the official victory story starts to fall apart. On March 27th, Iran launched a coordinated wave of ballistic missiles and drones straight through the defenses of Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a direct strike on the operational core of the American air war. 10 U.S. service members were wounded. 2 were reportedly in critical condition. Multiple U.S. aircraft were damaged or destroyed on the ground. And all of it happened just after the White House was talking as if the war had already been won. That timing matters more than almost anything else, because it forces one question nobody in Washington seems eager to answer. If the war was already won, then why was Iran still able to hit one of the most fortified bases in the region? And why was the response so quiet? To understand the scale of this, you have to understand what Prince Sultan actually is. It is not just a base. It is a critical nerve center. It supports aerial refueling. It supports command and control. It supports sortie generation. It supports the entire rhythm of American air operations in the region. In other words, if this base is disrupted, the air war becomes slower, harder, and far more expensive to sustain. And Iran appears to understand that better than most people in the public do. This was not the first time the base came under fire. It was the third. On March 1st, an earlier Iranian barrage wounded Army Sergeant Benjamin Pennington. He died days later. Another strike earlier that same week wounded 14 more personnel. Then came the March 27th attack. That means the same base was breached repeatedly in less than 4 weeks. Not once, not twice, 3 separate times. And that pattern is what makes this so unsettling. Because this was not random chaos. This was repetition, refinement, escalation. Iran was not just firing. Iran was learning. Every new strike seemed to go deeper. Every new wave seemed to test the defenses harder. Every new breach seemed to reveal something the previous one had not. And while all of this was happening, the public messaging was moving in the opposite direction. On the morning before the strike, Trump told the world that Iran had no meaningful military left. He said its navy was gone. He said its air force was gone. He said most of its launchers were destroyed. He said the war had been won. That is the kind of statement that sounds final. It sounds absolute. It sounds like a closing chapter. But the battlefield did not behave like a closing chapter. It behaved like a warning. Pete Hegseth stood beside him and pushed the same victory message even further. They spoke as if the story was already over. Yet the missiles kept coming, and the silence from Central Command made the situation even more telling. They did not deny the strike. They did not confirm the full scale. They did not explain the losses in a way that calmed the public. They said almost nothing. And sometimes silence reveals more than a press conference ever could, because what was damaged there cannot simply be replaced overnight. The KC-135 Stratotanker has been in service for decades. It is old, it is scarce, and it remains essential. There are only about 400 left in the entire U.S. Air Force. They exist so fighters and bombers can stay in the air long enough to reach their targets and return safely. Without them, the air campaign slows. With fewer tankers, every mission becomes more strained. Every strike package becomes harder to launch. Every hour of sustained combat becomes more expensive. The planned replacement, the KC-46A Pegasus, has been plagued by delays and cost issues. So, if one of these aircraft was hit on the ground, the loss is not just physical, it is operational. It is strategic. It is the kind of damage that creates a gap no one can fill quickly in the middle of a live conflict. And that is only part of the problem. The E-3 AWACS fleet is even more fragile. Only 31 remain in U.S. inventory. These aircraft are not just flying radars. They are airborne command posts. They watch the sky, they track threats, they coordinate intercepts. They connect the whole battlefield into a single picture. If even one is damaged during a shooting war, the entire air defense network becomes less effective. And replacing that capability is not instant. The E-7A Wedgetail is still years away from fully filling that role. So if Iran hit aircraft like these, then it was not just striking metal. It was striking the structure that makes the air war function. This is where the story becomes much bigger than one base, because Prince Sultan was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because it matters. It is close enough to be useful. It is important enough to hurt. And it sits inside the system that keeps the entire regional air campaign moving. That is why the strike lands with such force, even before the smoke clears. It says Iran is not firing blindly into empty desert. It is selecting pressure points. It is forcing a cost. It is turning every defensive success into a financial and logistical headache. And that is where the numbers become horrifying. Marco Rubio reportedly told lawmakers that Iran produces more than 100 missiles each month. He compared that to the 6 or 7 interceptors American factories can produce in the same time. That ratio is the whole story in one sentence. More than 100 incoming weapons, fewer than 10 new defensive rounds every month. That is not a comfortable equation. That is a structural problem. And when the opening days of a war burn through interceptors at a pace like this, the shortage becomes impossible to hide. On March 16th, analysis reportedly found that Gulf and U.S. Patriot batteries fired 943 rounds in the first 96 hours of the war. Think about that again. 96 hours, 943 interceptors. That means the defense is being consumed at a speed most people cannot even imagine. The Camden, Arkansas plant that produces PAS-3 MSE interceptors reportedly makes around 620 per year. So 4 days of combat used up more than a year's worth of output. That is not a temporary strain, that is depletion. And depletion changes every decision that follows. When inventories fall, commanders stop asking only what can be stopped. They start asking what must be stopped. That is a very different war, because it means something has to get through. It means the defense is no longer about perfect protection. It becomes about triage. The result is a battlefield where each side is measuring endurance as much as firepower. And Iran seems to understand that the real battle is not just in the sky. It is in the math. A single PAC-3 interceptor reportedly costs around $4 million. A Shahed drone can cost as little as tens of thousands to build. That means one side can force the other to spend dramatically more just to stay alive. Multiply that across hundreds or thousands of engagements, and the drain becomes brutal. This is why observers are calling it an attrition war. But even that phrase may be too simple. Because this is not just attrition by force, it is attrition by cost, attrition by fear, attrition by repetition. Every drone that gets intercepted still costs the defender money. Every missile that needs to be tracked costs the defender attention. Every base that needs to be protected costs the defender readiness. And every strike that gets through costs the defender credibility. That credibility problem is spreading beyond the Gulf. South Korea reportedly now faces pressure because Patriot systems may be pulled to support the Gulf front. Ukraine may also lose interceptors that were supposed to go elsewhere. In other words, the gap in one theater is forcing sacrifices in others. That is how a regional war starts reshaping global defense planning. Nothing stays isolated for long. Not the missiles, not the budget, not the alliances, not the panic. And the economic damage is already beginning to ripple outward. Before the latest strike, Brent crude sat far lower. Then it surged. U.S. crude pushed toward levels not seen in years. Oil markets reacted not because of speculation alone, but because the physical flow of energy was under threat. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a line on a map. It is one of the most important choke points on Earth. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil and fuel pass through it every day. That is about 1/5 of all seaborne crude on the planet. If that route is blocked, delayed, or destabilized, the effect spreads everywhere. Fuel prices rise, shipping costs rise, inflation pressure rises, global confidence falls. And that is exactly why the Strait matters more than almost any single battlefield in the Middle East. The IRGC's public posture has been aggressive. It has signaled that not 1 liter of oil should pass freely. Gulf production has been cut sharply because storage is full and exports have nowhere to move cleanly. Hundreds of millions of barrels have reportedly been stranded since the fighting escalated. That is an extraordinary disruption. Not theoretical, not distant, real, immediate, measurable. The first attempt by a major carrier to transit the Strait after the fighting began was reportedly turned back. That alone tells you how unstable the situation has become. But the energy shock is only part of the danger. The Strait also carries a huge share of global natural gas trade. It carries jet fuel bound for Europe. It carries fertilizer-related shipments that matter to food supply chains. It touches agriculture, industry, aviation, shipping. Prices in one corridor can become pain everywhere else. That is why this story cannot stay local. It has already crossed borders. And the longer it continues, the more it becomes a global economic problem, not just a military one. Meanwhile, Washington is doing something that looks like escalation and denial at the same time. More troops are being sent, more equipment is being moved, more defensive assets are being rerouted. But the language from officials still sounds like this is already finished. That contradiction is difficult to ignore. You do not send thousands of additional troops to a war you believe is truly over. You send them to a war you expect to continue, or worsen. Reports say elements of the 86th Airborne Division are headed into the region. Marine expeditionary units are also part of the buildup. Some reports put the number in the thousands. Others suggest even more may follow. And that raises a bigger question than troop count alone. Why would you keep adding forces if the main threat was already neutralized? The answer may be simple. It was not neutralized, it was managed. And management is not victory, it is delay. Then comes the political layer. Trump insists talks are going very well. Iran insists the talks are either fake or non-existent. One side talks about progress. The other talks about resistance. One side frames the conflict as under control. The other frames it as unresolved. That is not a minor disagreement. That is a complete clash of reality. And when two governments are describing the same moment in totally opposite ways, somebody is preparing the public for something bigger. Trump has also avoided using the word war. He reportedly called it a military operation instead. That choice is not random. It matters politically. It matters legally. It matters for public perception. Because the word war carries consequences. It carries scrutiny. It carries authorization issues. It carries accountability. And when vocabulary starts doing the work that policy should be doing, that tells you the pressure is rising. The battlefield, however, does not care what label is used in a speech. It only cares what gets hit, what gets through, what gets lost. And right now, the evidence suggests Iran is not just testing America's defenses, it is testing America's narrative. Every time a strike lands after a declaration of victory, the story becomes harder to defend. Every time a base gets hit after being called secure, the credibility gap widens. Every time reinforcements arrive, while officials say the war is finished, people start asking what the real plan is, because at some point, the words stop matching the map. That is where this becomes dangerous, not just militarily, politically, economically, strategically. The public is told one thing, the battlefield shows another, the defense budget reveals a third, and the troop movements suggest a fourth. Put all of that together and the picture becomes impossible to dismiss. This is not a neat victory. It is a widening conflict, it is an expensive conflict, and it is a conflict that appears to be forcing America to spend more, deploy more, and explain more while Iran keeps finding ways to hit back. That is why Prince Sultan matters so much. It is not just about the aircraft that were damaged. It is about what those aircraft represented. Mobility, coordination, reach, confidence. And when those things are damaged, even briefly, the psychological effect travels far beyond the runway. The question now is not whether Iran can still fight. The strike already answered that. The real question is, what happens when a government keeps calling something won while the war keeps proving otherwise? What happens when losses are absorbed but never fully explained? What happens when the defensive inventory runs low? What happens when oil markets stay nervous? What happens when allies are forced to sacrifice one front to protect another? And what happens when the next strike is even more accurate than the last? That is the question Washington does not seem eager to answer out loud. Because once you admit the battlefield is still active, the entire victory narrative begins to collapse. And once that narrative collapses, everything else becomes harder to control. The message is simple. The war may have been declared over in speeches, but on the ground, in the air, and in the markets, it is still very much alive. And the deeper this goes, the more it looks like the real crisis is not Iran's missiles. It is the gap between what is being said and what is actually happening. That gap is where public trust disappears. That gap is where strategic surprises happen. That gap is where escalation hides until it is too late. So the next time someone says the fight is finished, remember what happened at Prince Sultan. Remember the repeated strikes. Remember the silence. Remember the shortages. Remember the cost. Remember the oil. Remember the troops. And remember that on this battlefield, the story keeps changing faster than the officials can control it. Thanks for watching. Like this video if you want more deep breakdowns like this. Share it with someone who follows the conflict closely. Comment your opinion on what is really happening here. And subscribe to Market Mindset for more powerful updates, sharper analysis, and the next story before everyone else notices it.